Hi, Austin divorce lawyer Ben Carrasco here to discuss a topic that frequently comes up during my initial consults, and that is divorcing a narcissist. According to the American Psychiatric Association, approximately 1 to 2% of the population is affected by NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. But I can tell you that in my personal experience, far more than 1 to 2% of the folks who come into my office believe that their spouse is a narcissist. In fact, I would estimate that anywhere from 30 to 40% of the folks coming into my office believe their spouse is a narcissist. And if you discuss this or interview other family law attorneys, they will tell you the same thing, to the point where, with all due respect to our clients, we hear this so often that it has become a cliche and we are rolling our eyes in the back of our mind when we're hearing this. So, how to explain this disconnect? The relatively low incidence of NPD in the general population, but the high incidence of client prospects who believe that their spouse is a narcissist. Well, there's two explanations in my view. One is you're not correctly diagnosing your spouse. You're conducting armchair analysis online, you're looking at WebMD and going down a list of attributes that you are associating with your spouse, and you're coming up with your own clinical diagnosis. My supposition is that the behaviors, the toxic behaviors you are observing in your spouse and in your marriage are not necessarily the product of NPD or any other psychiatric disorder for that matter, but are simply the result of a much less clinical and nefarious sounding or ominous sounding explanation, and that is your spouse is simply an asshole. I think we can all agree that assholery is much more prevalent in the general population than NPD. It's much more than 1 to 2% of the population. I happen to know because I happen to be one myself. And it's not a very satisfying explanation, but I think that's probably the best explanation for what's happening here. You've been married for many years, you all have grown apart, you're sick of each other, and that conflict is manifesting itself in very unhealthy ways in the relationship. But nonetheless, you're obviously observing things in your marriage that are concerning about your spouse. So let's get to the question. Let's say your spouse does have NPD. How is it going to impact your divorce? The key takeaway here is it's probably not going to have much of an impact. Number one, the judge is probably never even going to know that your spouse is a narcissist because, as the client, you cannot stand up in court and offer a medical diagnosis. You can describe behaviors that you've observed. If your spouse is an addict, if your spouse has been physically or verbally abusive, you can talk about that, but you can't offer a diagnosis because you're not an expert, you're not qualified to do that, you're a party to the case. So the only context in which a judge is going to potentially hear from a medical professional with a diagnosis is if the judge orders a psychological evaluation, and that is exceedingly rare. Generally, we only see psychological evaluations in high conflict, bitter custody battles where the judge is concerned that a parent may pose a safety risk to the child. So what are some of the triggers? What are some of the things that could lead a judge to order a psychological evaluation? Well, if your spouse has a history of self-harm, threats of self-harm, if your spouse has ever been committed to a psychiatric institution, if your spouse has existing mental health disorders that are not being properly treated, if your spouse has a substance abuse disorder, drug or alcohol addiction, if your spouse has been physically and emotionally abusive to the child, not necessarily to you, but to the children, those are things that could lead a judge to order a psychological evaluation. At the end of the day, it's at the judge's discretion. And you should know that these evaluations are very costly. They can easily cost $10,000. They're intrusive, and they can extend the divorce process easily by 6 months to a year because you've got to hire the professional. The professionals are typically backed up. The process for doing the evaluation is quite exhaustive. And another thing to keep in mind is that what's good for the goose can be good for the gander. So if the judge orders your spouse to be evaluated, you may be ordered to be evaluated as well. And nobody is totally stable and normal and healthy. If you're subjected to a psychological evaluation, there may be things about your parenting and your personality that are unflattering, that are going to come to light. And if you have a trial in your case, both lawyers are going to seize on anything within those reports that reinforce their negative narrative about you. So we cherry pick those reports, we interview, we cross-examine and question the evaluator at trial, and it really adds it can add a stink bomb to the process that you would otherwise not have to deal with. Now, what about put aside whether there's a diagnosis, what about the behaviors that your spouse is exhibiting? Let's assume your spouse is just a difficult person. We don't need to call them a narcissist, but they're toxic, they're difficult to deal with. In the divorce process, that may manifest itself as them not complying with their discovery obligations, not following a court order, not following the advice of their attorney. They may be the type of person who cycles through multiple attorneys in the divorce. The thing to know is if your spouse engages in that kind of bad behavior, there are judicial remedies. If they don't respond to discovery, I can file a motion to compel, take them to court, and a judge can order them to produce documents that are relevant that we've asked for. If they don't comply with a court order, I can file a motion for enforcement. They can be held in contempt and potentially put in jail for not complying with a court order. Obviously, these things are costly, it's stressful, and it prolongs the process. But there are remedies. Now, we have no control over the relationship between your spouse and his or her attorney. If your spouse truly is a narcissist and you're not, I'm not the one dealing with them. It's the other attorney who's dealing with them on the day-to-day. So I can't control that relationship. I can't control what they do. And ultimately, the takeaway here is, in any case, any civil litigation, including a divorce, is going to have one or two outcomes. Either you all are going to settle your case or you're going to go to trial, whether your spouse has a disorder or not. Now, if someone is toxic, if they have NPD, does that mean that perhaps they're less likely to settle the case? Maybe, but I don't have any control over that. People are not required to settle. You are allowed to have your day in court if that's what you want, even if you end up burning down the village to get there financially. People are allowed to have trials, and we have to roll with it at the end of the day. So to summarize, if you believe your spouse has NPD, it may not actually be NPD. It may just be your spouse is a difficult person, a toxic person. The judge is unlikely going to know that your spouse has NPD because psychological evaluations are relatively rare in divorces. And if your spouse attempts to frustrate the legal process, if they don't comply with court orders, if they behave in a destructive way during the divorce, they're hurting themselves. Whatever outcome they ultimately want, they're making more difficult through their behavior. But more importantly, we have procedural mechanisms to deal with and to respond to that kind of behavior during the divorce. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, if you're in Texas, and in particular if you're in the Austin area and you want to consult with a divorce attorney, feel free to go to my website and fill out the consultation form, and I look forward to meeting you. Take care. Bye-bye.